here is Canada's Transport Minister, Marc Garneau. He's going to be joined at that podium by Ralph Goodale, who's, of course, Canada's Public Safety Minister, as well as the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, Ahmed Hassan. They're all there because they want to update the situation on what they're calling irregular immigration, people who entered Canada from the United States by avoiding regular crossings. It was such an issue last summer. We want to bring you up to date on it. We're going to listen in live as the minister brings us up to date on this issue, and obviously some measures to announce. So let's listen in live to the Transport Minister.
As well as the Minister of Immigration of Ontario and Quebec, and we provided the necessary resources for the processing of claims. We also accelerated the process in order to provide work permits by reducing the time frame from 3 months to 3 weeks in order to minimize the financial burden on the provinces. I also want to thank the Government of Quebec and the Government of Ontario for their work with asylum seekers and for the processing of those claims, as well as the cooperation they have shown with our federal government and between Quebec and Ontario. I want to ensure that everyone has a complete understanding of one thing. Asylum seekers at the border do not receive a free ticket of entry into Canada. They must go through a rigorous process. We believe that a little more than 90% of irregular migrants do not meet our criteria and will need to leave, as well as 200 over the next few weeks. The tireless work of our consulates and our colleagues, such as Emmanuel Dubourg and Pablo Rodriguez, with the Latin American communities and Haitian communities, has borne fruit. We have seen a drastic reduction recently in the number of asylum seekers of Haitian origin, although they represented the majority of people coming to the border last year. At the same time, the influx of Latin American migrants did not materialize. So that shows the success of these actions. Of course, the work is continuing, and we are monitoring the situation very clearly in order to ensure the long-term success of our message to the communities. The problem has evolved, and now we are facing a much different situation from the one we experienced last year. Now, asylum seekers are coming primarily from Nigeria. They come to the border following a very brief stay in the United States. We are therefore here to communicate some new measures that are intended to address that specific issue, and also to reassure Quebecers that there is a rigorous process in place to determine the eligibility of those who would like to seek asylum in Canada. Once again, we will take action right at the source and in partnership with the U.S. government. Therefore, we have deployed 3 Canadian officers to Lagos in Nigeria so that they can work with U.S. authorities in processing visa applications. And you also know that Minister Hussein will, in fact, be going to Lagos, Nigeria, at the end of the month in order to hold some important meetings with Nigerian officials. We are also investing $173 million in additional funding to strengthen security at our borders and to accelerate the process at the Immigration and Refugee Board. That funding, set out in Budget 2018, will allow us to hire 64 decision-makers for the board as well as individuals to assist them, which will make it possible to more quickly process the 17,000 refugee claims and the 3,000 appeals that concern Quebec. As you know, we will also be working very closely with the province in order to provide them with additional funding for the costs associated with migrants in 2017. We will also be developing with Quebec and Ontario a triage method in order to disengorge the major metropolises such as Toronto and Montreal. Unlike some, we are not going to focus on fear and division or be sensationalist. We will base ourselves on facts, and we will put in place the necessary funding so that we must ensure respect for our laws and provide the utmost safety for our Canadians. I will now turn it over to my colleague, the Minister of Public Safety, Mr. Ralph Goodale. Thank you, Mark. Dear colleagues.
Morning, everyone. I am very glad to join my colleagues here today with a strong message about border management, public safety, and national security. Bonjour tout le monde.
Good morning,
Du point de vue
everyone.
de mon portefeuille de la sécurité publique,
The mandate that I am given means that I must emphasize two main points when it comes to our border with the United States.
With the United States, we have the longest, most open, unmilitarized, and most successful international boundary in the history of the world. Some 400,000 people cross back and forth across that boundary every single day, plus nearly $2.5 billion in two-way trade every single day. As we manage that enormous flow, almost all of it hassle-free, 24 hours a day and 365 days of the year, we are determined to ensure that every Canadian law is properly enforced and all of Canada's international obligations are properly respected. That is my first point. And we are delivering on that commitment right now, despite the extraordinary flow of asylum seekers over the past year. Et nous voyons actuellement des résultats
And we
de cet
are
engagement.
currently seeing results
Malgré le volume
from that
extraordinaire
engagement,
de demandeurs d'asile depuis
despite
l'an dernier.
the increased number
All Canadian
of
laws
asylum
are
seekers since
and
last
will
year.
continue to be enforced, and all of our international obligations are and will continue to be honored. Toutes les lois canadiennes continueront d'être appliquées et toutes nos obligations internationales continueront d'être respectées. In this regard, I want to pay a big tribute to the frontline personnel in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Canada Border Services Agency, and the Federal Department of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship, who have performed their duties in a meticulous, professional, and highly effective manner to ensure public safety and national security. Secondly, let me make the point emphatically that coming across the border in a way that tries to circumvent the law or defy proper procedure is no free ticket to Canada. Deuxièmement, laissez-moi dire catégoriquement qui traverser la frontière de façon irrégulière pour contourner la loi et les procédures normales ne constitue aucunement un laissez-passer au Canada. Ceux qui le font sont immédiatement arrêtés. Those who cross in violation of the rules are immediately arrested. They are carefully interviewed. They are identified both biographically and biometrically. Their identities are checked against Canadian and United States databases for any immigration, security, or criminal flags, and they are issued a conditional removal order. If they present a risk, they can be detained as necessary. As a matter of due process, they are then required to prove their claim for asylum in Canada. In other words, they must prove that they need Canada's protection to keep them safe. Seeking asylum is not a shortcut to get around normal immigration rules and procedures. There must be legitimate reasons why asylum is necessary, or it will not be granted. If their case cannot be proven, they become inadmissible and will be removed from Canada. That is what the law requires, and it must be, and it is, and it will be enforced. The CBSA is constantly monitoring each case as it proceeds through the determination process and taking steps to effect removals as quickly as possible to maintain the integrity of the system. S'ils ne prouvent pas leur cas, ces
If they
personnes
cannot
sont
prove their
déclarées
case, these people
inadmissibles
will be declared
et seront
ineligible
renvoyées.
and will be
C'est
removed.
ce que la loi
That
impose,
is what the
et
law
elle est,
requires,
et elle doit
and
être appliquée.
it must be
In
enforced.
managing our border, as you might expect, I speak very regularly with my counterparts in the U.S. Homeland Security Department, first Secretary Kelly and then Acting Secretary Duke and now Secretary Nielsen. They have a similar issue with asylum seekers, but much larger numbers along their southern boundary with Mexico. Most recently, at a meeting of G7 security ministers in Toronto, Secretary Nielsen reaffirmed our close cooperation. She committed to vigorous efforts to prevent the abuse of U.S. travel documents. A U.S. visa should not be used as a conduit to try to jump the border into Canada. Similarly, DHS, with support of CBSA, is working to interdict illegitimate travelers before they get to the northern border. The United States is also continuing to provide at least 18 months advance notice of any proposed policy change which could affect border flows, and they share Canada's zero tolerance toward any hint of human trafficking, smuggling, or exploitation. In our 2018 federal budget, the Government of Canada invested $173 million in our border security agencies and departments to ensure we have ongoing capacity to handle current and evolving situations, including the matter of timely removals. In the Lacolle area most recently, we have seen about 70 to 80 people arriving per day. Up to now, we have had sufficient capacity to manage such volumes and to move people away from the border promptly. In the near future, we'll be adding extra temporary facilities at Lacolle to ensure children and families are treated appropriately if their stay near the border has to last beyond one day. We will also continue to work closely with provincial counterparts to manage pressures and concerns. Nous ajouterons bientôt des installations
We will
additionelles
be providing additional facilities at Lacolle to ensure that children and families are treated properly if they remain close to the border for more than one day. We are also continuing to work very closely with our provincial counterparts to address any concerns they may have.
Terrorism and persecution in various parts of the world, and due to damages caused by climate change, failed and failing states, economic dysfunction, and other factors, global human dislocation and migration are higher now than at any time since the Second World War. Because of our geographic location in North America, Canada is somewhat shielded from this global phenomenon, but we are not totally immune. To ensure that orderly immigration and the humane and compassionate treatment of genuine refugees continue to be Canadian strengths, we will continue to do what I emphasized at the outset. We will fully enforce all Canadian laws, and we will properly respect all of Canada's international obligations toward those who truly need our help and protection. For those who don't, There are regular immigration channels and rules to be followed, and they should do so. Ensuring the integrity of our borders and a sound, rules-based immigration system is a vital national priority.
Ensuring the integrity of our borders and a solid and properly regulated immigration system is an essential priority.
Invite my colleague Ahmed Hussein.
Bonjour, merci de vous
Good
joindre.
morning, and thank you very much for joining us this morning. We want to assure Canadians that the various levels of government are fully engaged in protecting our borders. As my colleague Goodale has stated, our priority remains the security and safety of all Canadians. Anyone crossing our border in an irregular manner is arrested and will not be released if that person represents a threat to Canadian society.
Anyone that crosses our border irregularly is arrested and not released into our community if they present a threat to Canadian society. To better understand how our asylum system works, I wish to draw your attention to the infographic beside me. Where's the infographic? It's right here. As this chart clearly demonstrates, all asylum claimants undergo the same process. Ils passent un examen médical
They take a medical exam and they are screened for security at the border. Their file is reviewed to identify issues associated with criminal activity and national security. Their biometric data are verified. Any person crossing our border in an irregular manner is arrested and is not released if it represents a threat to Canadian, or if he or she represents a threat to Canadian security. All asylum seekers are subject to a rigorous process. The eligibility of their claim is based on Canadian and international law. Our system reviews the validity of every asylum claim. It is also important to understand how asylum seekers register with our immigration system. Mr. Shale said at Tout le monde en parle that asylum seekers are creating delays in the immigration system. Let's be clear, asylum seekers do not take the place of other immigrants who come to Canada. And if that situation that does not affect asylum seekers coming here to join their family.
To make decisions on all other types of immigration applications. Canada, as you know, has a multi-year immigration plan that sets targets of how many people we welcome through immigration in family and economic classes. And we fully intend to meet those targets as we have done so in the past. In fact, thanks in part to these multi-year levels plans and our ambitious targets for regular immigration, we expect many remaining backlogs to be eliminated in 2019, by 2019. And we've already demonstrated that we can do that. For example, applicants who were stuck in backlogs in the spousal sponsorship program those backlogs have been coming down. And we've also improved processing times that kept families apart. So, for example, before we took office, spousal sponsorships used to take 26 months or more. We've reduced that processing time to 12 months or less in 80% of the cases. We've also managed to eliminate 20,000 people who are stuck in backlogs in the spousal program, as well as many, many more thousands in the living caregiver program, which used to take 5 to 7 years, down to 12 months or less. And we intend to eliminate the 18,000 living caregiver program backlog by the end of this year. To further strengthen our border security operations and our ability to process asylum cases, Budget 2018 invested $173.2 million towards managing irregular migration. As part of this allocation, Budget 2018 allocated $74 million towards the Immigration Refugee Board, and this will be used to hire 50 new decision makers in the Refugee Protection Division of the Immigration Refugee Board and 14 new staff in the Refugee Appeal Division. This will result in the ability of the Immigration Refugee Board to process an additional 17,000 cases every year for refugee protection, on top of the 40% productivity improvement recently, and also be able to process over 3,000 refugee appeals in addition to the ones that they're able to do that. So these investments, as I've said, will ensure that those asylum claims that are refused will move faster through the process so that they can be removed in an expedited manner. With the additional investments in Budget 2018 and the ongoing collaboration with various partners, we've also made progress over the last several months to plan for potential influxes of irregular migrants. We continue to work very closely with our missions in the United States, engaging directly with communities in that country and issuing messages on social media channels in Canada and the United States to reach people who could potentially make their way to Canada. Since Labor Day 2017, our embassy in Washington, D.C., as well as our 12 consulates in the United States, have engaged over 120 U.S. decision makers, including Congress representatives, governors, lieutenant governors, and they've also met with over 460 diplomatic representatives, NGOs, community leaders, municipal, county, and state level officials across the United States. We realize the importance of this work, and we know that this outreach effort has borne a lot of fruit, as has been addressed by my colleague, Minister Goodale. We also know that a number of the recent asylum claimants are Nigerian nationals with valid U.S. visas. And it's becoming apparent to us that they've obtained these visas with the intent to come to Canada to make asylum claims. So for the last number of months, we've been working very closely with our U.S. counterparts to address this particular situation. We've been sharing information with the United States to prevent the abuse of the U.S. visa system for the sole purpose of claiming asylum in Canada. And the U.S. has taken action with respect to this issue. This includes canceling visas and denying applicants visas. We've seen, for example, recently an increase in visa refusals by the United States to Nigerian nationals. We value and appreciate the continued collaboration between our two countries, which is vital to the integrity of our shared border.
Our government is working in close cooperation with the Nigerian government. In February, representatives of that country went to Abuja and Lagos, where they had productive discussions, including with the Nigerian Minister of Foreign Affairs. We are also maintaining close ties with the Nigerian High Commission here in Ottawa.
We continue to work very closely with our U.S. counterparts there at the U.S. diplomatic mission in Abuja, as well as the consulate in Lagos. Specifically, we've sent 3 temporary duty officers to work with U.S. officials in Lagos. I will also visit Nigeria in the near future to further build on these outreach efforts and liaison with senior Nigerian government officials on these issues. Although these irregular crossings have occurred in different locations across our country, we of course appreciate very much that Quebec is receiving a disproportionate number of asylum claimants. Since our government first became aware of this situation, we've been working very, very closely, hand in hand with the government of Quebec, and our relationship is even stronger today. We've heard Quebec's call for help to move asylum claimants to other provinces as quickly as possible, should they not wish to remain in Quebec. Since our last meeting of the ad hoc intergovernmental task force on irregular migration, our 9th such meeting, we've been working to bring into action this concept of triaging at the border, and I look forward to this coming to fruition very soon. In this context, it's also important to understand Canada's international obligations with respect to asylum claimants. Asylum claims are governed in part by international treaties in which Canada is a signatory. This includes the 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees. So we have a legal responsibility to uphold these treaties and to process these asylum claims. But if those claims are refused, those claimants will be placed in the removals process. There have been some questions also about the conditions relating to the Safe Third Country Agreement with the United States.
A major issue, and there, as you've been watching live from Montreal, 3 senior cabinet ministers, the Public Safety Minister, Ralph Goodale, the Transport Minister, Marc Garneau, and there, the Immigration and Refugee Minister, as he continues to lay out an issue that is before the government, obviously increasing through these spring and summer months, and that is the issue of people who are arriving in this country, entering Canada from the United States, avoiding regular crossings. So these are irregular migrants arriving here, and the whole process of the circumstances under which they're allowed into Canada, under which they are sent back from Canada. The numbers speak to the urgency of this issue. In 2017, 20,000 people came in this way. In the first 4 months of this year, 5,000 so far. 91% come in from the border of Saint-Bernard-de-Lacolle in Quebec. 91% crossing into Quebec. Many arriving there at that Lacolle crossing after walking or taking a taxi from upstate New York. Evan Dyer is in Ottawa. Evan Dyer has been to that Lacolle station, that Lacolle crossing point, and can speak to this directly. Kind of interesting listening in. People may be perhaps mystified. It seems to be a major reassurance message that we got from all 3 ministers there, Evan, very much reassuring Canada that it is not a free ticket in to just walk across and expect to be received with open arms.
Yes, absolutely. Much more about reassurance than any specific new announcement. In fact, something of a lesson, that's sort of Asylum Claim 101, complete with an infographic from the Minister of Immigration to try to reassure people, in the words of all 3 ministers, that people are being arrested, as they all put it, on crossing this border. 2 of the 3 also used the expression, no free ticket. And we saw some statistics from the Minister of Transport, Marc Garneau, who said that over 90% of those who are currently crossing are not expected to qualify. He went on to say that 200 will be removed in the next 2 weeks. So yes, this is an attempt to reassure the Canadian public, also the government of Quebec and the Quebec public, that this problem is under control, that the rules are still being applied. And we heard a message also directed at people who are perhaps waiting for family members through the family reunification programs, or people who are trying to immigrate through normal channels to Canada, because a lot of the frustration often comes from people who themselves are immigrants or waiting family members, saying that this is a case of queue jumping. And we saw Ahmed Hassan explaining that these spots that might be taken by refugees, if their claims do indeed prosper, don't take away those regular spots for immigrants and family reunification cases, and trying to reassure people that that system is being sped up and not being slowed down in order to deal with all of these irregular arrivals.
It was interesting to talk, as we followed this last year when it really came to the public attention. It was basically people from Haiti, people from Somalia who were walking across into Canada. Clearly, it's that demographic profile has changed. These are asylum seekers from Nigeria, and you heard him, a number of the ministers say they're going to send 3 officials to Lagos to try to expedite some of the visa process. Also, the minister himself going there to try to stop this kind of irregular and illegal crossing. But it was interesting, they both kept talking, Nigeria obviously a partner, but the largest partner here is the United States, because Canada can't tackle this alone. Is there appetite at the U.S. administration for any cooperation on this file?
I think it depends on which category of people are coming across, and really we can break it down into three classes of people with whom the U.S. would probably only be willing to help us with one of those three categories of people. So as you mentioned, we saw a lot of Haitians crossing last year. Those are people who had temporary protected status in the United States, which had been extended over the years because the U.S. government judged that they couldn't return to Haiti, even though the immediate cause of their departure, the earthquake, had gone away. The country was still in no state to receive them. There's an even larger number of Central Americans living in the U.S. Under the same kind of status, and that status is now being lifted by the U.S. government, and those people are going to have to leave the United States. There's no sign on that one that the U.S. is willing to roll back those decisions, and once it decides to expel those people, well, they're already in the United States, so that's already really the main step that a migrant needs to take to get to Canada, because once you're in the United States, it literally is just a matter of walking across. The second group, these Nigerians who are arriving now, I think are a group where the U.S. is both more willing and more able to help, because these are people who are not in the United States unless the U.S. gives them a tourist visa, which they can then use, and we've seen in the case of Nigerians, are using to walk into Canada. So the choke point there is back at the U.S. consulate in Nigeria, and we saw Ahmed Hussein say the Americans are already issuing fewer visas. That should theoretically result in fewer Nigerians showing up at the border. And then the third group, an interesting group, you mentioned Somalis. These are people who in many cases entered the U.S. illegally at the southern border. Some of them flew from Africa to Brazil or Ecuador, two South American countries that allow Africans to come in without visas, and then walked and caught buses all the way through Central America and Mexico to the U.S. border. Those people are typically crossing in Manitoba when they get into Canada. But that's a form of irregular migration that's illegal at every step of the way, and so the U.S. is not really in a position to do anything to prevent that. So even with the best cooperation between the U.S. and Canada, the streams of migration are such that it's impossible to stop everybody, and this problem is going to continue to be a problem at the Canadian border no matter what happens in Washington.
As I'm listening to you, I'm watching as well that news conference continuing with the three ministers, so we'll keep an ear there, Evan and I and our CBC News team, and if there's any further headlines, we'll certainly update that story. But Evan, thanks very much for helping us understand the context to that, the primer really on irregular immigration, migration that the ministers are anticipating and confronting with that news conference this morning. Thanks, Evan.
Thanks.